seconded, so now we're going to hear from Tony McQuail.
Well, thank you all for coming, and a special thanks to my nominator and my seconder, people I've worked with over many years. I'm no stranger to running, but to me the tragedy is that the things I was concerned about 40 years ago are still things we need to be concerned about. And so, in thinking about this election, I wanted to think, what's my focus? And my focus is 3 R's: representation, regeneration, and redistribution. 100 years ago, there was the Winnipeg General Strike, when the metal workers were looking to get collective bargaining accepted. They were hoping for better working conditions and for better wages. And they weren't getting anywhere. So they called for a general strike, and 30,000 Winnipeggers joined their call for a better deal for the ordinary people of Winnipeg and of Canada. The telephone operators, the factories and the shops and the transit and the city services all shut down. This is pretty scary for the powers that be, because we have to remember that at that time, Canadian democracy was thoroughly in the hands of the 1%. Women didn't have the vote, and people without property didn't have the vote. So the only people who were electing the government were the people who were male and wealthy. And what happened? Well, those representatives in Parliament sent in the Mounties, strikers were clubbed and shot, and a bunch of people were arrested, one of whom was J.S. Woodsworth, one of the founders of our political movement. So, after that, after the First World War, women got the vote and ordinary working people got the vote. The Liberals and Conservatives represented the 1%, and the United Farmers Movement and the independent laborers started to try and get together and represent the rest of society. And so farmers and factory workers, small business people, they became the heart of the political movement that was then, in the Depression era, in the 1930s, became the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, in which J.S. Woodsworth was one of the leaders, and then in the 1960s became the NDP. Now, in this election, you may have noticed that Elizabeth May likes to talk about the old line parties and how the Green Party is not one of the old line parties. But I think she's lost sight of something, because the New Democratic Party is not an old line party. That's the Liberals and the Conservatives. As I say, they trace themselves back to that 1% of property owners who had the vote before the First World War. And unfortunately, that was part of the reason I got involved with the NDP back in 1980, because we were struggling with a high interest rate policy that the Liberals reviled when they were in opposition and defended when they were in government. And the Conservatives reviled when they were in opposition and defended when they were in government. It was like they traded speeches when they traded places in the House. I couldn't figure it out, what was going on. And then Maclean's came out with an article that looked at where the parties got their money. And the Royal Bank was giving $50,000 to the Conservatives and $50,000 to the Liberals. And Nova Scotia was $25,000, Montreal $50,000. And the NDP didn't accept money from corporations. And so, well, I woke up and those parties were still serving the 1%. And if you look at SNC-Lavalin and what happened there, and all the other lobbying that's gone on for both the Liberals and Conservatives, that's who they're still serving. In a sense, if you think about it, it's the game we used to play with our younger brother or sister. You know, heads I win, tails you lose. Did you ever play that with a younger friend or relative? Not very nice, but well, it's Conservatives I win, Liberals you lose. And that 1% has been playing that game with us for 100 years now. But what we need is a frontline party. And that's what the NDP. It's been the frontline party on behalf of ordinary people ever since its inception, fighting for health care, for pensions, employment insurance, working conditions, both a healthy environment in the workplace and in the ecosystem. Because that first time I ran, the NDP was saying, you don't fight inflation that's caused by a quadrupling of the oil price during the Arab oil embargo, and then another doubling of the price of oil during the first Iraq war, by high interest rates. That just makes this problem worse. You're going to deal with it by moving to a lower energy intensity economy by shifting to renewable energy. And that was what we were talking about then, and a Made in Canada interest rate policy that reflected the real risk to borrowers when they loaned out money, not the huge inflation response that they were getting. So, why my 3 R's? Well, representation, because we didn't get it after the last election. We were promised that we would see 2015 as the last first past the post election by Justin Trudeau. And from my perspective, it was an incredibly cynical lie. He was trying to get Greens and New Democrats and even Conservatives in staunch Liberal or NDP ridings to give him that vote once so they'd never have to vote strategically again. But he got his phony majority. Liberals, you lose. And there we are. Oh, no, don't need to do that. No, didn't get what I wanted, which was an even crookeder system in terms of really creating a representative parliament. But why is democracy important? Why is representation important? Because at its best, democracy helps us find a society's collective wisdom. But it doesn't work if everybody isn't at the table. So we need real majority governments, not phony majority governments with their policy lurch one way and policy lurch the other. It's terribly wasteful, it's terribly expensive, and it's really unproductive. And we need everybody at the table. We need conservatives at the table. We need liberals at the table. We need Greens at the table, and we need New Democrats at the table, trying to figure out what the majority of Canadians want and support because they actually represent the majority of Canadians. In the New Deal for People, which is what the New Democrats have put forward for this election, we're talking about having a citizens' assembly to develop a mixed member proportional system to implement before the next election. We need everybody's vote to count every election if we're going to make steady progress on things like climate change and building a society that works for everyone. My second R is regeneration. I have a couple things here. There's a little book here called Conquest of the Land Through 7,000 Years. And it's a story about soil. And if you look closely at the cover here, you'll see there's what was a massive building structure covered over with sand and desert. And this ag scientist from the U.S. Department of Agriculture went out and visited places that were the birthplace of civilization and found deserts because people had not looked after their soil. And if you don't look after your soil, you've got problems because that's what underpins our food and our society. The problem that we're in now is that those were localized ecosystem destruction. But we're now in a situation with a global economy where we have a conquest of the planet. And we're living beyond its means. So we have to be very careful of the kind of cancerous corporate behavior that is considering the environment just a source of resources and consuming them far faster than they can be replaced. And that brings me to my second show and tell for tonight, which is one of my favorite economists was a woman named Hazel Henderson. And she said, as an economist, I'm tired of pie charts. I want a cake chart. And so she produced her cake chart. And she said, the economy is like a layer cake. And it's really important to recognize that each layer rests on the one below it. So the bottom layer of the cake is the ecosystem, the environment, is the natural bounty that supports all life on this planet. And the next layer is what she also called the love economy, the community, the family, the place where we don't exchange wages, but we do stuff with and for each other. And then she said on top of that is the public sector, which provides the infrastructure and the glue that holds society together in many ways. And then on top of that is the private sector. And each sector is dependent on all the ones below it. And I would like to suggest that in today's society, there maybe should be candles on the cake called transnational corporations. And they're there and they're up at the top of it, but they depend on everything below it. And yet, in terms of our media and our attitude, we're so fascinated by the Dow Jones Industrial Average and the TSC, but not on oxygen levels and water quality and things like that. But the thing that I think we have lost sight of in many ways when we think about the environment is that the environment isn't something out there. And it's not something just at the bottom of the layer cake. Because each time we take a breath, each time we take a drink, each time we take a bite, what was out there becomes in here. And some of it sticks around and becomes part of us. So we are integrally connected to and dependent on the environment. And so it's not just important to talk about sustaining, because at the moment we're not in a good place. I don't want to sustain where we are. I want to look at how we regenerate and improve the conditions. And from our personal experience, back in 1973, we bought a farm that had been cash cropped. It was a hilly farm, and the soil was pretty eroded and was in pretty rough shape. It had pretty low organic matter. But over the years, we rebuilt the soil, increasing the soil organic matter probably by 3.5 percentage points. What does that mean? It means that our soil has sequestered a bunch of carbon, taken a bunch of carbon dioxide out of the air, and through photosynthesis, put it back into the soil. It also means it's increased its water holding capacity by about 25,000 gallons per 1% increase in organic matter. And what that means is that it's also increased the farm's resilience in the face of drought or flooding. So I know that this can be done. We can do this in agriculture. We know a lot more now about soil and soil biology than we did 45 years ago when I was in university. And so we know how to do it. We don't need new technologies to do it. We've got the equipment to do it. We've got the seeds to do it. But we need to help the farm community look at how to improve soil management so that we are sequestering carbon, so that farming becomes part of the solution to climate change, and at the same time makes our soils more friable and better at holding water and more resilient in the face of the uncertainties that we certainly seem to be experiencing now with climate change. But we also need to be thinking regeneration across our whole society. How do we manage our inputs, our flow of stuff through the economy, so that what was a resource has become a waste, becomes a resource again, becomes a waste, so that we're cycling things much more carefully and using much less energy. So I think we need to recognize that we've spent 100 years developing a fossil fuel addiction. I mean, we've substituted fossil fuels for labor. We've substituted it in many ways for fertility through fertilizers. We've substituted it for a lot of things in terms of pest control in agriculture and weed control. And we've also substituted it for materials. If you go to buy a snow shovel now, it's got a plastic scoop, and it's got a plastic handle, and it's very hard to find a shovel with a wooden and steel handle anymore. So we've been really good at turning oil into profits for oil companies and chemical companies. And we've basically burned through millions of years of fossilized solar energy in a century and a half. But we don't have 100 years to kick the fossil fuel habit. And if we don't kick that habit, start to make the transition to a lower energy economy, a renewable energy economy, and a regenerative society, we're going to be in trouble. And I really believe that the time for magical thinking is over, where we can say, well, if we just ignore it and pretend it's not there, it will go away. Some problems are like that. But I don't think the problems we're in today are like that. So pretending it's not there isn't going to make it go away. And not dealing with it is going to make it a lot more costly and maybe even impossible to resolve if we don't start now. But there's another form of magical thinking. We'll declare a climate emergency, and tomorrow we'll give you a pipeline, and we'll... What we need is meaningful action. And in the New Deal for People, we're talking about meaningful action. Retrofits to help ordinary people lower the energy cost and the energy use of their housing. A transportation system that looks at how we reduce our energy use. And in our rural areas, I think we can become creative in thinking about ways that we can reduce our energy intensity while at the same time increasing our sense of connection and community. I don't know if you remember, but when I ran in 2008, I talked about the idea of ride sharing. You don't have to buy a fancy new car to double your passenger fuel efficiency. You just have to give somebody else a ride if you were going somewhere by yourself. And then you might even have somebody to talk to. I had a great campaign because I hitchhiked with my sign, and I got to meet a lot of people I wouldn't have otherwise got to meet. It was great. I might try and do it again this year. But we need to be developing local solutions that help us reduce our energy intensity and increase our sense of community. Because that, as an ecological farmer, one of the things I soon realized was there isn't a solution that fits everybody or everything. You need to develop things that are appropriate for your community and for your environment. But in the New Deal for People, we're looking at ending fossil fuel subsidies, creating a Canadian climate bank that will invest in renewables and hopefully help kickstart some of those local ideas of how we can do things better, both for our community and for the environment. Tommy Douglas used to say, "Take heart, my friends." I'm not going to try and do his accent. "'Tis not too late to build a better world." But it's getting pretty damn close. When he was saying it, there was still a fair bit of time. I don't think we have that. The third thing I want to touch on in part of my 3 R's, and I am taking a leaf from Tommy because he said, "Tell him what you're going to say it, and tell him what you said." So I think the 3 R's of representation, regeneration, and redistribution is something people may be able to remember. I found it works pretty well as an elevator speech. But redistribution. My dad was an accountant. He worked with some very rich folks. And he said, one of the funny things about money is the more you have, the more you can want. And another thing he said, which is what I'm going to touch on in terms of redistribution, is that money is like manure. It does the most good when you spread it around. And I get to spread some on the farm, so I know exactly what he's talking about. But both at the global and at the Canadian national level, we've seen the concentration of wealth. The fact that the increased productivity of our workforce and our communities has not been being spread out amongst those who produced it, but it's being concentrated more and more at the top. And it's been justified on the basis of what's called the trickle-down theory. And I think it was as a high school student, I drew a cartoon, which was my term of the trickle-down theory, and it had a rich guy drinking cream, and it was trickling down on the poor, and you can imagine the process. It has to do with the digestive system and the bladder. So, in a sense, that's where we've been at. The trickle-down theory may have worked at one time. It may. I'm not at all sure that it did. But it may have worked if the people who were getting the wealth passed to them through tax breaks and all sorts of other things were living in the communities that produced them, and it trickled out from their expenditures in that community. But when the wealthy live in gated communities, when they don't live in your country at all, when they're transferring the tax breaks and the wealth that's flowing up to them out to the Grand Cayman Islands and to bank accounts and other places, it ain't working. It isn't creating jobs. It isn't building the community. So I think we need a trickle-up theory where the people who create the wealth get their fair share of it, spend it on the main streets and in their local communities. And one of the books that I found very interesting recently, in which I'm going to pass out to you, I can't do a thing like this without some show and tell, is called Donut Economics. And it's another economist. I don't have my banner yet. I'm hoping we will. But she basically has drawn a donut, and on the outside of the donut, the outer ring of the donut, are all the ecological boundaries that we need to stay within if we're going to keep humanity in a good spot in terms of its relationship to the environment. Water quality, air quality, pollution, those sorts of things. And the inner circle of the donut are the social boundaries we better not fall below if we're going to have a good society. Very interesting idea, but she has a good chapter on what she calls distributive by design, creating an economy where the wealth and the resources in the economy end up being spread out rather than concentrated. So people, you can share and take a look at it, have a look. But of course, we already have a lot of that going on. I think 9 million Canadians are members of cooperatives or credit unions. Those are ways in which we have changed the relationship of the enterprise to the community. So for me, the New Deal for People is important because with pharmacare, childcare, post-secondary education, a fair and progressive taxes, investing in our communities, those are all ways that we create a more distributive economy. And for those of us who know people in the States or in other countries that don't have our kind of healthcare system, we can start to appreciate just how important that one aspect of our Canadian society has been in creating a more equitable opportunity for health and healthcare. And pharmacare, dental care, child care, post-secondary education becoming more cost available to people will be a huge benefit in terms of creating a more distributive economy and society, and a fairer and progressive tax system, and also one where we go after tax avoidance and tax evaders by the biggest players will also help a great deal. So for me, I've been very pleased with the New Deal for People. I hope you'll take a look at it. It's available on the web.
There are
2 copies back here. But it looks to me like a comprehensive blueprint to help us get on with the transition to a more representative, more regenerative, and more redistributive economy. And I now am going to be very exciting and open my shirt here because you'll notice it's green or orange. I'm green as an environmentalist, not necessarily as a specific political party, but every child matters. And that's what politics needs to be about. It needs to be about the kind of future we're building for our children and our grandchildren, the kind of community that we're creating. And as Tommy Douglas said, it's not too late to build a better world, but my friends, we sure better get going on it. So thank you very much.